Bibles, we're going over into the book of Ruth. We're going to be looking at Ruth, the story of Ruth, but we're going to take a little different direction with it. Usually when we read the book of Ruth, we see Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, and the story of how Ruth and Boaz get married, and a very romantic story. And then there's the verse where Ruth tells Naomi that whither thou goest I will go, and whether you lodge I will lodge, and your God will be my God. And we think of that as as I've heard others say, that was part of their marriage vows. The loyalty one to another. But we're going to take a different tack this morning. We're going to look at Ruth as a story of redemption. So I want to begin by reading from the lesson text in Ruth, the first chapter. We're going to look at all 4 chapters. Ruth, the first chapter, verses 16 and 17. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Then going to Ruth, the second chapter, verses 9 and 10. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels, and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Then she fell on her face, and bowed herself to the ground, and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? Then going over to Ruth, the third chapter, verses 11 through 14. And now, my daughter, fear not. I will do to thee all that thou requirest. For all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. And now it is true that I am thy near kinsman, howbeit there is a kinsman nearer than I. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning, that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman, well, let him do the kinsman part. But if he will not do the part of a kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of a kinsman to thee, as the Lord liveth. Lie down until morning. And she lay at his feet until the morning, and she rose up before one could know another. And he said, Let it not be known that a woman came into the floor. And then going to the 4th chapter of Ruth, verses 9 and 10. And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, Ye are witnesses this day that I have brought all that was Elimelech's, and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren, and from the gate of his place. Ye are witnesses this day. So Boaz took Ruth, this is verses 13 through 15. So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife, and when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. Now, as I said, the lesson revolves around the story of Ruth, but it's not the story of the romantic love between Ruth and Boaz. It's not about Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, but it's about a deeper sense of redemption. A while back, I nearly lost the property that I owned because I hadn't paid the taxes on it. And when I did go to pay the taxes, they told me the house had been sold. And I went back and, well, when I went and they told me the taxes had been paid, they said, but you can redeem it. And I had to come up with the money to redeem my house and get it back. So that's what redemption means, is something that is important to you that you get back. But you have to pay a price for it. Now, if we look first of all in chapter 1, or chapter 1, in verses 1 through 5, we see the background. Elimelech is living in Bethlehem, or he's living in Bethlehem, and there's a famine. So what happens is that he goes and takes his family to the land of the Moabites, because he's heard that there's food plenty there. And he takes his wife and his 2 sons with him. And because of the famine, they're living in Moab. And while they're living there, Elimelech dies and leaves Naomi as a widow. Then the sons marry Moabite women, and they live there with their mother in Moab for 10 more years. And then after 10 years, they also die. So that's left Ruth, Naomi, and Oprah with nowhere to go. You know, they're almost left destitute. They're in a Naomi's in a foreign country. Her husband and her sons are dead. Her daughter-in-laws are widows. More than likely, if she stays there, they will end up marrying into another family, and then Naomi will be left alone. So in chapter 1, verses 6, beginning with verse 6, Naomi makes a decision. In verse 6, she arose with her daughter-in-laws that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people, giving them bread. So she learns in verse 7 that the famine that was in Israel is over. So she goes back home. In verse 7, her daughter-in-laws go with her. They went on their way to return unto the land of Judah. So her daughter-in-laws are going with her. Then in verses 8 through 14, Naomi gives her daughter-in-laws a choice. Naomi said unto her 2 daughter-in-laws in verse 8, go return each to her mother's house. In other words, you can go on back home. I'll go on by myself. Y'all can go back. You're still young. You can find new husbands, and you can still be accepted in your homeland. In verse 10, the daughter-in-law said, surely we will return with thee unto thy people. Naomi in verse 11 says, no, you turn around, my daughters. Go back home. Why will you go with me? Why would you want to go with me? There are no more sons that I have that you can marry. I'm too old to have a husband. If I should have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight and should bear sons, would you wait for them to be grown up to marry them? No. You're not going to wait 18 years for a child to grow up and become a man that you can marry. So they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Oprah kissed her mother-in-law, and she left. But Ruth clave unto her. She stayed with her. She was showing her loyalty. And then in beginning with verse 15 and the first part of verse 16, Ruth says, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. In other words, she's showing her loyalty to her. She was steadfastly, in verse she decides in beginning with verse, the last part of, in verse 17, she decides, where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Now she'd already said, for whither thou goest I will go, and whither thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. In other words, Moab, the Moabites, was a land of idolatry. Naomi had come into Moab as a believer in Almighty God, in Jehovah. She had held on to her belief in Jehovah. And now that she's going back home, Ruth is telling her, I'm willing to lay down my gods that I worshipped in Moab, and I will follow after Jehovah God. She is showing the fact that she has willingly accepted the Lord.
She not only loved her mother-in-law, but she loved God too.
Exactly. That's what she's saying. She's saying, Naomi, I love you so much, I'm going to go to your land. I love you so much, I'm going to accept your God. I'm going to lay down everything I've had. I'm going to leave my home, my family, my friends. I'm going to even leave my gods behind to follow you. And here's the spiritual application. Look at Mark the 8th chapter, verses 34 through 37. Jesus is speaking, and he said, when he had called the people unto him with his disciples, he said unto them, whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? You see, Ruth is saying, I'm giving up everything I have and everything that I knew to follow after God. Naomi has shown me a different way. So I'm giving up, I'm denying myself, and I'm going to move to a new place to serve God. So then in chapter 2, beginning with verse 1, she has reached Bethlehem. Now, what has happened is that when they get there, they see Boaz, and she asked Naomi about Boaz, and in verses 1 and 2, Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said, go unto her. She said unto her, go, my daughter. Now, what's happening is Ruth is thinking, because he's a kinsman, maybe he'll give me a chance to work in his fields. Now, they didn't have what we would call a welfare system. They didn't have the government giving them food or money while they were out of work or while they had retired. What they had instead was they would have the fields, when they would harvest the fields, there was also always some left behind. So rather than going back through the field and picking all that up, that was left for the poor. For them to come and pick up what was left. That was called gleaning the fields. And what they picked up was theirs. So Ruth is saying, I'm willing to go out there and glean the fields and glean these ears of corn. Now, when the Bible was written during the 1600s, in the King James Version, they didn't recognize corn as being the yellow ears of what we call corn. That word corn simply meant grain. And this was, I think, the time of the barley harvest. So it was grains of barley. And she was going out and picking up these grains of barley that had been dropped. Or it was either wheat or barley. So she was picking up these little grains off the ground. And in verse 3, Boaz learns about Ruth. She went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And Boaz, in verse 4, came from Bethlehem and said unto the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered him, The Lord bless thee. Then Boaz said unto his servant that was set over the reaper, Whose damsel is this? Who is she? I don't recognize her. Then in verse 6, the servant begins to explain. Said, This woman came to me and asked me for permission to glean in the fields. And she came and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little while at the house. In other words, she went home during the night and come back this morning, and she's been working ever since. She worked all day yesterday. She went home for a little while, came back, and when we started to work, she was back in here working again. So he learns a bit about Ruth, and enough in verses 8 and 9. He said, Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Now he's being very generous. If she abides by the maidens that belong to him, then she's entitled to eat with them. He tells her, when you get thirsty, well, actually he says, I've got young men out here to carry water. And I've told them they better not touch you. Because, you know the old saying, boys will be boys, men will be men. She's out here working with these women, and they think she's a stranger. One of them might try something with her. So I've told them to leave her alone. But I've also told them, when thou art athirst, go into the vessels and drink of that which the young men have drawn. So she's not having to worry about bringing her own water to the fields and losing time going to the well to get the water, come back, and then try to go back to work. She can drink of the water that's already there. So he's showing his generosity. Then in verses 10 through 13, she falls on her face and bows herself to the ground and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldest take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? And Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath been fully been shown me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law. In other words, he's saying, I know your reputation. I know who you are, and I know how you take care of your mother-in-law since her husband died. And how you've left your father and your mother and the land that you were born in, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not. All to help Naomi out. So I'm looking at you, I'm seeing your faithfulness. I'm seeing that you're modest. You've not come in here bragging about who you are and what you can do. He said, I've seen you working. I know that you're a hard worker. You're loyal. You're hard working. He said, you're modest. You know, all good attributes that a person should have. To be loyal, hard working, to be modest. He said, the Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Here's the spiritual application. He has been ready to have compassion and mercy upon her. He's doing everything he can to help her. Right? In Psalms 86, verses 5 through 7, For thou, Lord, art good and ready to forgive, and plenteous in mercy unto all them that call upon thee. Give ear, O Lord, unto my prayer, and attend to the voice of my supplications. In the day of my trouble will I call upon thee, for thou wilt answer me. What has Naomi done? She has gone to one person to find the help that she needs in the middle of her problem. The problem is her and Naomi have come back from a foreign country. But what have they come back to? Naomi's husband's dead. Ruth's husband is dead. There's nobody there. So who's going to help them to eat? Who's going to provide for them to have clothing? Who's going to provide their food, their shelter? She has turned to the one person that she thinks can help them, Boaz. Isn't that the same type of spiritual thing that the writer here in Psalms is talking about? Is when we have a problem, that we can take it to the Lord? Because the Lord is good and ready to forgive. He is plenteous in mercy unto all them that call upon Him. You see, when Ruth went to Boaz and called upon him for help in gleaning the fields, to help her by letting her glean in the fields, he reacted in compassion and mercy, just as the way the Lord does when we have a problem or a situation and we go to Him. He will act in our behalf, just like Boaz did for her. Then we see, if we go over to chapter 3, Ruth's claim for redemption. Now it's gone from, Ruth is bringing up more than just gleaning in the fields. Ruth's actions were a custom indicating her desire to marry. Well, let me get into that. Verse 7, When Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was merry. He went to lie down at the end of the heap of corn, and she came softly and covered his feet and laid her down. And it came to pass that, her actions here are a custom indicating her desire to marry Boaz. You see, she's looking for a deeper relationship. Now, when in verse 9, when he wakes up and sees that she's laying at his feet, he talks to her and she says, I am Ruth thy handmaid, spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid. What that indicates, if he covers her with his skirt, or actually what it means is a corner of the blanket, if he takes that and puts that blanket over her, that's an indication that he has accepted her proposal and that he will protect her from others. Then she says, For thou art a near kinsman. Now here's the reason that she's doing that. In Deuteronomy, the 25th chapter, verses 5 through 6. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of an husband's brother unto her. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of his brother which is dead, that his name be not put out of Israel. Under the Mosaic law, when her husband died, Ruth is not supposed to go out and find another husband because she has no children. If she'd had children, she could have gone and found another husband. But because she's childless, under the Mosaic law, she is supposed to go to the nearest kinsman. And that's what she's saying, for thou art a near kinsman. In other words, this is your responsibility. You are to supposed to marry me, have a child by me, so that my husband's name will not die out from Israel. Now that was under the Mosaic law. So everything that she's bringing up is true under the Mosaic law. And then he says something else. He said, "Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich." Now, there's two things here I want us to look at. First of all, he's looked at her and said, "You've showed kindness and mercy." If you go on down in Deuteronomy, the 25th chapter, the next couple of verses talks about what happens if a near kinsman refuses to do his duty. The woman is supposed to come to him and tell him, "You're my near kinsman, and you have to marry me and have a child by me." If the man says, "No, I'm not going to do it," then she goes to the elders of the city, bring them to him, and they will ask him, "This is your near kinsman. You're supposed to marry her and have children by her. Are you going to do this?" If he says, "No, I'm not going to do it," then they spit in his face. What? They spit in his face. Then they take his shoe off of him. And then they run him out of the city. In other words, he loses all of his privileges and his rights as a citizen of that city because he won't do his duty. That's what Ruth could have done. Ruth could have gone to the nearest kinsman and told him, "You have to marry me. I don't care what kind of trouble it causes in your family. I don't care what it matters to anybody else. This is what you're going to have to do by law." But she didn't do that. She went to Boaz at night and in privacy and did what she did, the custom was, in fact telling him, "You're my near kinsman, you need to marry me." In chapter 3, verse 11, Boaz accepts Ruth in his legal responsibility. Verse 11, "Now my daughter, fear not, I will do to thee all that thou requirest. And for all the people, all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman." Now the other thing that I want us to notice, what did he tell her about going and getting water?
That the young men would draw the water.
Yeah. So in effect, he was making her, even though he had warned the men, he was putting her in constant contact with the men. And what does he say at the last part of verse 10? "Inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich." In other words, you didn't go to these young men and start hunting out a husband or a boyfriend. You went, you got your water, you went back to work. You wasn't here husband hunting. Or you're not out here looking for a boyfriend. In other words, I can see that not only are you loyal, not only are you diligent and hardworking, not only are you modest, but now I see that you are also righteous. You're trying to do the right thing. Not out here looking for a husband, not out here, more or less using this as an excuse to be around a bunch of young men to find a young husband. He said, you're not only modest, but you're also righteous. He said, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. So he's saying, I'm going to do it. I'm accepting your proposal. I'm willing to marry you. But there's a problem. There's another kinsman in verse 12 that is nearer than I. Stay here this night verse 13, and in the morning we'll find out if he'll do what has to be done, if he will marry you or not. He says if he will, let him do the kinsman's part. But if he will not, in verse 13, if he will not do the part of a kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of a kinsman to thee. So lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, and then she rose up before anybody else woke up and slipped out, because he said, let it not be known that a woman came into the floor. If somebody saw you sneaking in here, they'd think the worst of you. They'd think you're doing something wrong. So just slip on out before anybody sees you. Here's a spiritual application. Galatians 4, verses 4 through 5. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So just as Boaz was willing to redeem Ruth under the Mosaic law, so we see Jesus came willing to redeem us from under the law of sin and death. And then we see in chapter 4 that Boaz takes 10 elders of the city and goes to the nearest kinsman, and then informs them of Naomi's desire to sell some land. Under the Mosaic law, the nearest kinsman has the first right to buy it. If he refuses, then the next kinsman has the right to buy it. But when that kinsman, in verses 1 through 8, finds out he's going to have to marry Ruth, he refuses. No, I can't. I don't know. I might lose my inheritance if I do that. So Boaz publicly tells the man, I'll tell you what, if you'll sell me your right to that property, if you will sell to me that part of all that Elimelech and his sons owned, then I'll buy it. And I'll take the responsibility. I'll take over what you are supposed to be doing. And the man agrees to it. Then we see in verse 9, Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, ye are witnesses this day that I have brought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. Then in verse 10, moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. In other words, he publicly announces he's purchased the land. He's purchased all that Elimelech and his two sons owned, which includes Naomi and Ruth. And now he is taking Ruth to be his wife. And when they heard this, the people in verse 11 said, we are witnesses. We agree with you. We have seen what's happened. We're your witnesses. So he goes, well, let me back up. There's a spiritual application here. Well, that's the spiritual application about the fullness of time, is that's what Jesus did for us. As our elder brother, when Adam sinned in the garden, Adam gave up his right and put us all under the curse of sin. When Jesus Christ was born and overcame death, hell, and the grave, he was also our nearest kinsman. And now we can come to him and be redeemed by him, because he, by his own purchase, has purchased us with his own blood. He has redeemed us with his blood. So, chapter 4, beginning with verse 13, there's a blessing from God for Naomi. So Boaz takes Ruth and marries her in verse 13, and she becomes pregnant and has a child. And Naomi, though, if we look at it in verse 14, Naomi, the women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord. Blessed be the Lord which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman. In other words, Naomi, here's a blessing from God for you. You have a son. You've got another son. And his name may be famous in Israel. He shall be unto thee a restorer of life, and a of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom, and became a nurse unto it. You see, the blessing that was laid upon Naomi is she is blessed with a new family connection. When she was living in Moab, she was a widow and had no family except her 2 daughter-in-laws. When she comes home, she has a new life. Now because Ruth and Boaz are married, she has a new family connection. She has a new life. And now she's got a new responsibility. She's got a new life. He's going to, verse 15, He shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age. And she is being blessed with a new responsibility. Verse 16, she became a nurse unto it. You see, that's kind of what God does for us when we become saved. John 10:10, the thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Ruth was moving from a dead-end life where she was at. That when she came home, when Naomi came home and reunited with her God, with her people, she had life more abundantly. And then finally, there was a blessing not only on Boaz and Boaz and Ruth with the child. There was not only a blessing on Naomi because she has a new family connection, that she has a new life and a new responsibility, but there's a blessing from God for all mankind. In the following genealogy, Ruth became the great-grandmother of King David, and ultimately the ancestor of Jesus Christ. In Titus, the 2nd chapter, verses 11 through 14, we see the spiritual application. For the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world, looking for that blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God and our Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave Himself for us, that He might redeem us from all iniquity, and purify unto Himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. Because of the faithfulness of Ruth, God used that faithfulness to bring redemption not only to Ruth and to Naomi, but also to all mankind. I'm going to close right there. As my daddy would say, keep your soul upon the altar and keep looking up, because Jesus is coming soon.